Just roll the tape.
This whole situation is a farce. There were recent reports that illegal migrants have been put up in a luxury rural hotel, a former stately home near Grantham, which normally charges £400 a night. Surely the easier you make this whole process and the quicker, the more people will come. Especially as it's a complete pushover with a large number of young Albanian men claiming modern slavery, which is ridiculous. Isn't the solution, and will the Minister confirm this, to repeal the Human Rights Act, get out of the European Refugee Convention, repeal the Modern Slavery Act so people can be detained when they arrive for being involved in an illegal activity and then deported?
So in the name of clamping down on refugees and, in general, some of the most vulnerable people on the face of the planet, this Tory MP stood up on the House of Commons and on the floor declared essentially that all our rights and freedoms should be abolished. Not actually hyperbolic, as it turns out. Should we just go through what this Tory MP wants to just get rid of? So first off, the Human Rights Act, much maligned, demonised, attacked by the right-wing media. Unfortunately, the contents of the Human Rights Act is never actually discussed, because if it was, any rational human being who wasn't a little bit sociopathic would, I would imagine, agree with the contents of the said act. Let's have a look. It protects your right to life, quite important actually. It prohibits torture and inhuman treatment. Again, I think hopefully we can have a consensus on that. It prevents people from being treated like a slave or subjected to forced labour. I don't even want to start thinking about the number of people in British politics who have a problem with that. It gives people the right to liberty and freedom, gives people the right to a fair trial. Again, quite an important pillar of a democracy, and no punishment without due law, ensures respect for privacy and family life, the right to marry, protects freedom of thought, religion, belief. You can actually think and believe what you want, that you have free speech, that you have the right to peacefully protest, that you're protected from discrimination, that your right to an education and free election is secured, and that your possessions are protected. That's the Human Rights Act in sum. That's what he wants to scrap. That's what he wants to get rid of. I've gone through the contents of the Human Rights Act. Again, this Tory MP, in the name, as I've said, of waging war on the rights of refugees and migrants, wants to scrap rights that you are actually protected from, you're protected from tyranny by this act, which unfortunately this Tory MP does not want to protect you from. Now, you're probably wondering what the European Refugee Convention is. As it happens, so am I, because there is no such thing as a European Refugee Convention. This Tory MP just stood up in the House of Commons and demanded that we scrap a convention, that we withdraw from a convention that doesn't actually exist. Now, I presume he's actually talking about the 1951 convention relating to the status of refugees that expanded in Article 14, if we're going to get all technical, of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's a United Nations treaty. It defines what a refugee is, it sets out their rights, and each country's responsibilities. Now, it was signed in Geneva, Switzerland, which I guess is in Europe, which is presumably what he's talking about. But it sets out the protection that all refugees, the rights, if you like, should receive without discrimination, like not being punished for entering a country without permission. So it's countries' responsibilities, refugees' rights. Now, in the case of the United Kingdom, the government has suppressed most safe and legal routes. We have fewer asylum seekers entering the country than we did in the early 2000s. But the fewer overall numbers are more likely to be arriving in boats than other forms of transport because, again, the government has ensured that other routes are closed off. Now, we take far fewer refugees than France, Germany, and around 86% of the world's total refugees are hosted in poorer countries. So anyone looking at the convention, the refugee convention that he's actually talking about, and thinking that somehow Britain has been turned into some sort of soft touch, which is just taking and absorbing all the world's refugees, is completely and utterly delusional. Now, this lot keep going on about people from Albania, even though most Albanian asylum claims are accepted by the Home Office. Why is that? Well, mostly they're women who are likely to be trafficked. But they don't talk about, for example, Afghan refugees, asylum seekers, who are almost coming in the same numbers as those from Albania. Afghanistan. Do you remember that country? Yeah, that's the country in which Britain was directly involved in an armed conflict for 2 decades and is complicit, I'm afraid to say, in vast human rights abuses and the deaths of civilians, and generally in a violent conflict which has killed huge numbers of people and plunged that country into violent mayhem. That's without talking about the West's complicity in supporting the Mujahideen against the Soviets back in the 1980s. That did not pan out well. Now, again, I think we've got a responsibility to those asylum seekers, but instead what we're doing is demonizing them without looking at our own complicity in their fate. Finally, the Modern Slavery Act, passed by a Conservative government, no less, back in the coalition years. It was brought in to stop criminals trafficking human beings and putting them into slave labour, and make sure that businesses have policies in place to combat such trafficking and slavery. Now, actually, the law doesn't even go far enough. It's been criticised by experts for being weak on victim protection. Just as one example, it doesn't extend legal aid to slavery victims, survivors in civil matters. Those are the 4 pieces of legislation this guy wants to get rid of. That's where we're at now in British democracy. We're at abolishing legislation protecting freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of assembly, the right to an education, the right to marry, abolishing just a treaty on refugees, or withdrawing from that treaty, which the vast majority of countries on earth have signed, even though we're not doing anywhere near our fair share of taking in refugees. And they want to abolish an act which prohibits the trafficking of humans for slavery. That's what the Tory MP is calling for. And it just goes to show that this war on refugees and migrants, as if it's bad enough on its own terms. These are human beings. They're flesh and blood, like you and I. They're people fleeing terrible violence, terrible trauma, terrible persecution, terrible suffering that the vast majority of those watching this video or listening to this podcast will never have to endure. Now, but it doesn't stop. It doesn't stop it then, because what they'll do is then scrap, or want to scrap, rights and freedoms which they claim are being abused by those they demonize and dehumanize, but actually also protect you, protect those you love, protect your families, protect your communities, protect people in your country. That is where we're at. And that's why this conversation, this so-called discussion, becomes ever more dangerous, because throughout history, the scapegoating, the demonizing of the other, of foreigners, paves the way to tyranny. It's not migrants and refugees that have repeatedly plunged, particularly European countries, into violent mayhem. It's those who've sought to demonize them and have paved the way to their own tyrannous power, using the hatred and bile targeted at those who are othered as not being part of the nation. Those are the people you should be really scared of, because, as I've said, history tells us it's those people who threaten your rights, threaten your ability to live in a secure and free country, not the migrants and refugees they demonize in order to build their way to power. Please like, subscribe, support us on patreon.com/I'm I'll see you soon.